Hi everybody. So today is the third part of my journey into this whole world. I just read a little bit about the next section and I'm like, oh, I didn't even know I wrote this all down. But yeah, I guess there was a lot of experiences that came with this, and I must have written it, as I was going through it, and or took it from my journal entries, and yeah, I will continue now. One day in April, while driving on the bus to pick up the little boy, I kept telling the school bus driver that something was not right with his wheelchair. I have no idea why I knew. I just knew. It kept going around in my head. And when we got to the school, I went to him and checked the wheelchair. The spirit's way to help me was to make me cough when I was at the right place, and I was right. There were actually a few things very wrong, and the wheelchair had to be brought to the mechanical room to be fixed before we were able to take off for our trip back home that day. The girls came to me before we left and asked me how I knew, and I told them that I just knew. How can you explain to them what they just would or could not understand? But it helped. And oftentimes today, when I start doubting myself, I think back of these times that felt in a way certainly unreal, even for me. Yet I know they happened and others experienced it, so I know it wasn't just my imagination, but reality. Later that month, I had 2 episodes where I didn't show up to work. My mind definitely was on overload with everything that happened, and I went on sick leave. I had several times the thought of, I need to get off the road, and within a short period of time, I had given up all my work. Sadly enough, I didn't really know what to do now. I had constantly voices in my head, and looking back now, with the knowledge I have, I know that there are low entities around that will invade your space if you are not careful. But at that time, this was all so new to me. I couldn't stop my mind from going, and so many things never made sense. This was certainly a very hard time for my daughters as well, seeing me totally falling apart over the next few months. I recall one experience that started just before I stopped working. I was up early every morning, more like the middle of the night, and I would first sit on the couch and just let my thoughts flow, and I would know exactly what would happen the next few minutes when I go outside. I would know exactly what truck would pass the house, the old lady who was walking by the house, if she was or not that morning. At the same time, every morning, sitting on the front step of the house, a skunk would walk by. At the beginning, when I saw him, I would instantly go into the house, since he was only a few feet away. But as the days went on, I just kept on sitting there, and one morning he came up the steps and right to my feet. I never moved, and he turned around after a minute sitting at my feet and just left. I had no fear whatsoever at that time. Something inside of me just knew that it was okay. When I told people about it later, they would just look strangely at me, not believing it was real. But it sure was. And now, 2 years later, I keep seeing the skunks over and over again. I meet them in the trail I walk daily, and on other occasions as well. Many times I would just head off for drives with no direction really. I think my mind was just looking for an escape to what it had gotten into, and probably peace. Most times though, I drove up towards White Lake because I would always see the deer, plenty of it, during my trips up the valley. One other thing also stood out during this time. I had gotten a letter about the tsunami during this time from someone in Spain, and when I researched it, I found out something that only makes sense to me now, so many years later, after it happened. I was working at a local nursing home at the end of 2003, and the evening when the tsunami hit, I was the only staff left that evening, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I became very dizzy and I could barely walk anymore. I had to sit down several times, catching my breath, and a few minutes later had to phone my boss and tell him that I could not continue working the rest of the evening. He came and saw that something was totally off with me, but thinking back, it was certainly my reaction to what was happening on the other side of the world at that exact moment. In July, in one of my moments, I texted Randy when he will come and get me. I guess I really needed to get out of whatever world I was in. And he texted me back on Sunday after July 1st, asking me why. I am not sure what my answer was, but we ended up talking, and that day he invited me to come to White Lake for a boat ride. I took Amy with me, and we had a beautiful summer day on the water, was jumping in the water several times. He spent the first night in a month at my place that evening, but sadly enough, it ended right away again. It seemed just so normal by now. We met and just knew it wasn't working. The following few weeks were a blur of constantly driving, being up in the middle of the night, going for drives, doing what needed to be done, but nothing made really sense still. I just couldn't get my thoughts straight anymore at this point. Then, just before his birthday, I remember that I thought, I need to go to the hospital. I need help. I had set out driving to go visit his grandfather's grave in Smith Falls, but halfway down, the thought came to me that I needed help. I had no idea how to get to the hospital, but I did drive to Ottawa and then ask for directions at the gas station. I still remember that day so well. And then I stood in front of the hospital and thought, no, I really don't need this. They're just going to drug me, and that's not good. So then my mind went totally off to another world, and I had these wild illusions of a much better world. Ended up driving up Island Park, crossed the river, and it ended up at the marina where, for several times now, I had these voices telling me that I should leave my shoes. I still to this day have no idea why that was so prevalent that spring. No shoes. But it was certainly a recurring theme, and sadly enough, I not only left my sandals there that day, but I also dropped my keys. I just had this voice telling me to drop the keys, and I did. And I walked away. I never got that set back. When reality kicked in shortly after, the keys were gone. Lucky enough, I did have my spare on me that evening. Then I left, and my grandiose thought continued. I thought I would drive to White Lake. It was 9 p.m. by then, so I took off towards there. I knew my way up to the valley very well, and I remember the exit I took. I had taken it several times before, and the next thing I knew, I was at the corner of Martin Street and Almont. I have no idea how I ended up there, but it wasn't anywhere near the exit that I took. But I'm aware that this can happen, certainly in the world outside of our perceived world. From there, I headed to the hospital, but they wouldn't let me in. I remember that much, and I went home. The next day was the day before his birthday. I remember only from that day that I was out and about driving around in the evening, and then I went to the hospital in town, and they told me I needed help. My thoughts were constantly racing. But of course, they tried to help me, but I wouldn't stay and take any meds, so I told them I would leave again. And the strangest thing happened right there. The nurse said to me, when you come back the next time, I will put the warm blanket on you. Of course, I had no idea at that time that this was exactly what would happen. From the hospital late that evening, I drove back to Almont, sat on the river for the longest time, and then I had a terrible attack. I was so angry at him all of a sudden, and I went and picked up a rock, drove up to his shop, and threw the stone with all my might through the window. And I clearly remember picking up that stone in my anger. the spirits yelling at me, "No, Andrea, we won't let you do that." But nothing would stop me. After throwing the stone, of course, the reality of my reaction really hit me. And I drove to his house and had the thought that I would have to die because of what I had just done. I sat in his porch and cried and cried and cried. Then I left again, and I know my mind certainly was in a total disarray, to say the least. I drove back to my hometown again, parked the car at the river, still thinking I have to die, went into the river and tried to drown myself. And here were the spirits again yelling at me. It is like it was yesterday. I can still hear it now. The voice is so clear. "Andrea, are you nuts? You are not going to die. Get out." And I did. And I jogged the 2 kilometers to the hospital, wet as I was and certainly very, very sick. And as I get there, the same nurse from earlier that evening put the warm blanket on me. I stayed till the morning and then told them I needed to go home. I remember walking home in my bikini, since I had refused to take any nursing scrubs. It was a very hot morning, so it didn't matter, except that it really isn't appropriate to walk through the streets at 9 a.m. dressed was that little. Of course, the way my mind was not working well, it didn't matter to me at that point. And then later that afternoon, my thoughts just would not get back to normal. I told Amy to phone the police, and they came and picked me up and brought me to the hospital. And from there, I was brought to the psych ward at the Ottawa hospital, where I stayed for almost 3 weeks. I remember very little from the first 2 weeks. I know that Randy came the first night and I was talking all nonsense. I still recall most of what I said to him that evening, but after that I have almost no recollection. My kids told me later that I had to be isolated into a single room because I was very violent. The one thing I very clearly remember was a few days after being in the hospital. It was my friend's birthday, and I did phone him from the hospital with my calling card. In my total disarrayed state, I remember my calling card number and how to get his phone number at home, where I left a message. I had a very vague recollection of it, but he did confirm it to me a few weeks later. With the whole sad side of all this, I do remember a funny story during my hospitalization. The ward was very well locked off and protected, but yet one day I was determined I was getting out of there, and I did manage to get off the floor by getting out when someone else was leaving, then running to the elevator, and I made it all the way outside till they caught up with me. Leave it to me. I guess the urge to be outside was very, very strong. After 2 weeks in there, I slowly started coming around, actually remembering slowly and realizing when I had visitors. I was allowed outside with company at first, and then alone, which was my most treasured moments at that time. And then the last weekend there, I was able to go home for the long weekend, but had to come back every night. And then, as sudden as this visit there had started, after the long weekend, I was told I could go home. When the doctor came and told me, I said to her, "I cannot go back there. It's a dump. I just did not want to go back to the place that had been home for the past few years." Somehow, all of a sudden, the darkness of the place, the rundown rooms, the smallness really seemed overwhelming. But of course, I didn't have a choice. So I went home, facing my unpaid bills of the last 2 months, including 2 months' rent. And since I had run out of EI, no money in my account or coming in anymore. So I had to face reality and headed to the local government office to get help. No matter what, we still had to live. We needed food and clothes. The bills needed to be paid. Of course, little did I know that even though none of this was my fault, it just happened. I became sick. It doesn't make any difference to this government of ours. When I applied for help, I was told that I get a monthly allowance of $961 for myself and my two girls, to which I replied that my rent was $8.95. And the lady's response was to get a cheaper place. How could I afford a move, pay first and last months, when my allowance for the months just barely covered my rent? We still needed to eat and pay the other bills in the meantime, no matter what. And of course, things still haven't really changed. I still felt very much off, even though my mind was a bit more quiet. It still just was not right. So I just managed for the time being, made part payments for the necessary bills. That was a longer section today. That's actually quite moving for myself, going back to this time. And yeah, what came afterwards were a long healing process after that. And it's definitely mental health is a big stigma, and it can happen to anybody, like literally. And yeah, hopefully people will learn from the experiences that this whole thing didn't really have anything to do with the spirit world or the angels or anything in that matter, but it really was just me totally overworked and ending up in the state I was. And yeah, the story will continue next time. Have a good one.